Welcome to Unstressed. My name is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Now, before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I am recording this podcast, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, today we are going to explore the world of being an ethical omnivore. And I think it is fair to say that for most of human history, that's been pretty well what we have been as a species. We've had an intimate relationship with animals over millions of years, and for Homo sapiens, certainly over 300,000 years, and certainly since the agricultural revolution, we've formed a much more intimate relationship with animals, but they have always lived in a natural environment, and we have always honoured those animals because, let's face it, they have provided us with some very important nutrients. Somehow we seem to have lost our way, particularly over the last 40 or 50 years of industrial animal agriculture. Well, my guest today is Grant Hilliard, and Grant is not only the co-author with Laura Dalrymple of this wonderful book, The Ethical Omnivore, but is also the owner of, together with Laura, of a bespoke providor of meat, Feather and Bone, who champion regenerative agriculture and whole animal consumption. I mean, literally honouring the whole animal through their journey through life. And as we have said many times on this podcast, it's not the resource which is the problem, in this case the animal, but the way in which the animal is managed. And there are just so many issues we cover in this episode. Look, I won't spoil it for you. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Grant Hilliard. Welcome to the show, Grant.
Thank you, Ron. Pleased to be here.
Grant, we met at that wonderful event in Fairlight a few weeks ago called Soil to Stomach, and I met and realised I'd re-met you. We've met before, but your book, which is The Ethical Omnivore, is just such a wonderful read, and the message is such an important one. I wanted to get you on and hear a bit more about this book, the story. I wondered if you might just share with us, because butchery didn't come to you through the family, did it?
No, not quite. It came really as a result of an interest in wine, and I would visit vineyards, and that seems sort of quite ordinary, to visit vineyards to see wine being made and where they're grown, and the idea that wine might represent a place in some, at various levels of faithfulness, depending on the method of production. So visiting vineyards was really sort of instructive, and I was sourcing wine mostly for a number of restaurants, but in the end, Sean's Panorama in Bondi. And
a wonderful restaurant of produce, not just food, but produce.
Yeah, that's right. And he had a real focus on that. And so it was a very big influence on me, really, and gave me scope to try and find things. And so I'd been sourcing sort of olive oil and garlic and other things that the restaurant used, as well as wine. And it didn't actually seem like such a big jump to sort of then say, well, what about if I got sort of a few lambs, or 3 lambs in this case, and you bought one of them, and we see how that goes. And because the parameters of sort of selection are quite similar, really. I mean, wine is sort of gussied up somewhat, but essentially it's just agriculture, and or at least the first part of the process is, maybe not the wine making, but the first part of the process is no different to growing anything else. And on that, if anyone's particularly interested in it, I would recommend a woman called Mimi Castile, who is an Oregon winemaker, who has a very deep sort of understanding of producing. She would argue that winemaking gets a free pass in a lot of ways in terms of regenerative agriculture, and I think she's right. She tries to account for all the productive capacity of her farm in winemaking just as much as we would be looking for in any other form of production. But there's a really good series, a podcast called I'll Drink to That, and there's an interview with her on that, but she turns up in various things. But that particular interview is really, really good. She's the most articulate winemaker I've heard in terms of trying to wrestle with the dilemmas of monocultural production. And that for any sort of agricultural practice is really sort of pertinent at the moment. How can we continue to produce? Well, we can't really continue to produce monocultural product. We have to find ways to diversify the production while still producing grain, while still producing legumes, while still producing all those things that are currently done as an exclusive monoculture in a simplified ecological system. So, which takes us back to the vineyard. I was interested in the vineyards that were not simplified systems, that were actually really quite complex productive systems. And it seemed that animals could also represent that. They're born on that farm, they eat the grasses and range of perennials and all sorts of things that occur on that farm. Why wouldn't they, with their genetics and their expression in that particular place, express something quite powerful as well, in the same way that we might think that wine does? And I was interested in genetic diversity because one of the key things that struck me in sourcing wine, obviously, the specifics of grape varieties is really important. But in lamb, in at least 15 years ago in Australia, it was virtually never differentiated by breed, and yet there are hundreds and hundreds of varieties or breeds of lamb, but we never bought it by breed, and it was never marketed by breed. And that to me was sort of curious. I was thinking, why does this particular market not insist on naming what it is? And I'd heard an interview with a woman who I don't know who, I can't now recall who it was, but it was on Radio National, and it was about, I just happened to catch a line of it, which was, "You haven't lived if you haven't tried eating Southdown lamb." And Southdown lamb, I sort of did a bit of research, is a very old variety of Southern English lamb. Sort of the grandparents of virtually all the English breeds of lamb that we would be familiar with, but in their own right, certainly not now, very popular. They had been the backbone of the prime lamb industry in Australia in the 60s, but in the swing away from fat in the 70s, they got dumped because they carry a little more fat, and they're quite short-legged. So they sort of traded them in. The whole Western District of Victoria, which is prime lamb growing area, used to be built on South Downs, but they were largely gone. In New South Wales, there was just one grower that I eventually found, and I convinced him to buy 3 lambs from him, and Sean's bought 1, and 2 restaurants bought each of the others. And it was a curiosity. Are these rarer breeds of lamb going to be any better than what we would ordinarily buy? I really didn't have a fixed sort of idea or position on it. I was just sort of, well, what's there to say about this? But it got a very strong response from those 3 lambs, and the rest is sort of history.
Well, that's quite a jump from buying 3 lambs to now running Feather and Bone.
Well, it is 15 years now, Ron. So
it is okay. Still a very relatively short time, and when you, as you have done, come into contact with people on the land, this goes back generations and generations. In fact, coming at it with a new perspective may be an advantage.
Yes, well, I think there's a lot of people in various industries that would say that you don't actually have to have a flat windscreen. You can have a curved one. You just have to convince the glass makers that it's possible to make one. So the apocryphal story about Henry Ford goes anyway, that he brought to it a different. Oh, actually, very interestingly, he also looked at the way animals are broken down in an abattoir as a disassembly plant, and then thought, this is how, if you reverse that process, this is how you produce cars. So that was an interesting sort of idea and that's what we do. We disassemble the elements of production and assemble them in a way that promotes connection between all the people that are engaged in any form in that process. So that's sort of where it's finished up after 15 years. We didn't realise we were doing that at the beginning, of course.
Well, there's so much of what you do that I want to cover, but it's still back on that diversity issue, because I don't think it matters whether you're talking about animals or plants. the industrial agricultural model has really, what's the opposite of diversifying? It's
simplified.
Yeah, because like I was surprised to learn that there was something like 300 varieties of cauliflower, for example.
Of which only about 6 are now routinely grown, probably.
I think that's exactly right. And I think absolutely everything that we see in our food retail offering has been dumbed down to be the most simplest form. And yet this connection with how our food is grown is just so fundamental to so much.
Well, and so it isn't just about livestock, the loss of different breeds of livestock. As you pointed out, cauliflowers, all the fruits and vegetables that we have access to, there was a vast range of them, and they were valued for all sorts of different reasons. And this is sort of the issue with the commodity market, is that it simplifies the system, the production system, but it also simplifies the consumption of it too. Yes. It's a very linear model. It can really conceive of simplified production, simplified consumption. And what we're trying to promote is the idea of a multifaceted, complex system. And the more complex it is, you get your resilience from that. We truly believe that resilience and diversity creates capacity. And in ways that we actually don't really understand. But it's sort of one of those things, you don't need to understand the process completely to allow it to facilitate its occurrence, which takes an act of faith. It also acts. It's about humility at some level, that you can never know anything. All you can do is see the small part that's in front of you, and so what we're firmly of the belief, and you are clearly too, is that complex systems produce complex food as well, and that complex food, which has all the micronutrients that you need, which are the triggerers for enzymatic action, which are then the triggerers for all sorts of metabolic processes that, we're now seeing the cost of that quite clearly. The metabolic disease, the non communicable diseases, they're all lifestyle related, and it's a term I sort of hate, but in fact it applies beautifully to the commodity market. It is a lifestyle. It's a lifestyle of emptiness, essentially. Yeah. And so everybody suffers from that simplified system. There aren't winners in that system. From a microbial level up, everybody is disenfranchised and disconnected, not least the producers themselves. And what we're seeing is a great emptying out of rural communities right through the Western world. And it's starting to happen in the developing world too, where everybody's flocking to the cities, away from systems that actually were multi-generational and multi-species production systems, to again a very simplified system, which is essentially a colonial impulse. It's in the service of very big money, and ag is very big money.
Well, another concept that I think is the way it is marketed to the public is that this is cheap and accessible. And I think another word you talk about, you mentioned complex. Another word that I like to use is holistic, because when you look at the holistic impact of this supposedly cheap food, it is actually not cheap at all. It's actually really costly to when you factor in health and environmental costs into it, which is a little more nuanced.
Well, yes, it is. I suppose this is where I would say that it is crucial that government gets involved. I mean, a lot of people in this space would say the last thing we want is government to be involved, because they will stuff it up and the wrong farmers will get the benefit from it. I sort of don't believe that. I think that actually has to be led very much. Well, it's one facet of it. Already consumers, I hate to use that word, people who are part of the production of food and happen to buy it and eat it, are demanding difference, and they're our customer base, and quite clearly supermarkets are also being pressured by that, hence their sort of desire to sort of try and reposition themselves in relation to free range eggs and sow stall free pork, which still means they live inside, but it's sort of just a way of just, smoothing that over. But at least you can see that demand is having an effect. The next step is for government to then recognise that you can't have coherent food policy unless you start to think about it in terms of water, ecological services, biodiversity generally. These are all considered as siloed sort of concerns. In fact, they're considered as hostile concerns. Well, you can have one or you can have the other. You can't have both. You can only think that if you think that you're outside of the system that produces it. And that's where the humility comes in. You have to understand that we are embedded in the system inextricably. There is no way that we can step outside it, and that our continued survival is highly dependent on it. We take it totally for granted, but it's sort of interesting to me and instructive that recent events in terms of extended drought and then fires following that, and then floods and then COVID, but it underlines just how sort of fragile those systems are. It really is an illusory sense of abundance because it's not built on anything solid. It's built on a superficial layer of fertility, which is only gained through the addition of increasingly expensive chemicals. Now, as soon as you do that, you then start winding down the fertility plane of production. And if you're working on a diminishing fertility plane, which is a way of describing 95% of Australian farming, your only option once your fertility declines to a certain point and you're still trying to maintain output is to add it. And at a certain point, that's going to cost you more than it's worth to produce. And most farmers reach that point earlier, and that's why the banks say to them, you need to get bigger. Because what they're really saying is that point where it becomes uneconomic, at least you can push it out for 20 to 30 years rather than having it confront you now. So instead of thinking of their farm as, we commonly refer to farms just in surface area. We say it's a 200 hectare farm or whatever it might be. Really, that's just it's a thin way of thinking about it, certainly, two-dimensional way. Mm-hmm. But more than that, it is actually thoroughly misleading as to what a farm is. It's a productive enterprise that operates certainly in 3 dimensions, and when you think about its operation through time, certainly 4 dimensions. The colonial impulse is that I've got 200 acres, I've got diminishing returns, I'll buy another 200 acres to supplement what I've done. And, the American experience is a classic experience where it was cheaper to buy new land in America than it was to keep the land that you had in any decent condition. Within 20 years of white settlement in America, they were talking about the problems of erosion. I mean, this is not sort of new stuff. This is very old stuff. And it's always sort of said, oh, well, this is caused by drought. Well, it's not caused by drought. It's caused by mismanagement that is then subjected to periods of extended dry conditions.
Do you know, I've really always been fascinated by the similarities between holistic healthcare and holistic land management. Mm-hmm. And so often in holistic healthcare, our diet is reduced to calories.
Quite, yes. Not
which is in the same sense as the value of a land being reduced to its acreage. But if we looked at it 3-dimensionally and were able to assess a block of land and its carbon profile, wow, wouldn't that change land values?
Well, wouldn't it?
If we took literally a 3-dimensional view of the land and said it's not just length and breadth, but it's depth as well.
Quite.
In the same way that food is not just calories, but it's its nutrients within those calories that are important.
And in fact, it's probably the calories that are the issue, because if we have excess calories and reduced or sort of almost negligible amounts of nutrients in much food. I mean, there's a lot of commercial carrots that they're $1 a kilo because really you could use them as a doorstop. You could use them for anything. I suppose they're used for juicing or something, but they're not, in terms of nutrient, they're worth very little. I mean, it's an interesting thing that if you measured the bricks of plants, and it's a measure of sugar in the plant, most plants sit at around, commercially produced, will sit at around between 4 and 7 on the brick scale. At that level, they will survive but they won't thrive. But if you get over 8 on the brick scale, then all of the secondary metabolites start to kick in, the secondary processes, and that's where the micronutrient comes from. That's where the perfume comes from. You know, if you should be able to walk into a room with a bunch of basil, and if everybody doesn't turn around the moment you walk, in fact, before you've even walked into that room, it says that the Brix level of that basil wasn't high enough to produce the perfume that it should have had.
Interesting.
Now we look at, you go to most shops and buy basil, and you have to put your head in the bag to even get a smell.
Yeah.
And that tells you totally about the health of that plant. It's just alive long enough to harvest. That's all it is.
I know you mention Fred Provenza in your book and that wonderful book, Nourishment. And I had the honour of talking to Fred on the podcast a little while ago. And this whole story of the phytonutrients within food, natural food, is extraordinary. And interestingly, I've just recently heard a podcast about growing meat in a lab and how this is really the future of agriculture. And I just think about the humble strawberry that Fred talked about with its 5,000 phytochemicals, phytonutrients in there, and thinking, my goodness, now I'm sure that person's got a PhD in whatever in their lab, but gee, I'd love to know how they're going to reproduce the complexity of natural food.
Well, they won't, but it's because they have no humility in the face of production. So if in a simplified system, you can replicate endlessly. In a complex system, you can't. So,
but Grant, one of the things that I really was so looking forward to talking to you, because you, as you said, we've only been doing this for 15 years, and I've actually been interested in holistic land management for 15 years.
All right.
But you have gone out there and developed really close relationships with growers and seen firsthand some of the challenges and some of the successes and some of the resistance to those changes. What's your perception of how that's happening out there?
Well, there are people who are most of the farmers that we work with, and that would be at any one time there's probably 40 different farmers product in the building on any given week. Over time, we're probably 120 different farms that we've worked with, and most of those people have come to it because they're dissatisfied with the production systems that they've either inherited or they've seen. So we've got a real mixture of people who are multi-generational farmers and people who have come to it late in life. And I suppose it's a bit like me coming to butchery, in that, if you don't know that you're breaking the rules, it's sort of, and if you're completely ignorant, it actually protects you in some ways. If a little bit of knowledge can be a dangerous thing, as they say. And I think that's probably true. I wouldn't have started doing this, I think, if I knew the difficulties involved in sort of butchery and setting up the systems, the logistics that you need to be able to manage that. But, you find sort of one step in front of the other, and all of a sudden that's where you get to. So for farmers, I think most of them, and it's an interesting thing that in fact, the farmers that we've worked with have never had a neighbour, an immediate neighbour, who farms the way they do.
Yes.
And, that's really quite shocking, because actually, there's a photo in the book there, which is a very telling fence line in the middle that was taken late in the drought. So it's early 2020 or late 2019. Late 2019, and it shows one of our farmers, a beef farmer, the grass is quite dry, but it's standing and it's covering, and then the next door is largely just dirt with a few sort of dead plants every 600 mil or so. For that farmer, he's thinking that grass should be in my cows, not, that's a waste of food. He only sees it from thinking that the product of what he's doing are the cows that he's selling. That's what he thinks he's farming. But the farmers that we work with don't think that. They think that there's a saleable product from what they do. That's their enterprise, or maybe multiple products, but there are saleable products from the enterprise. But the actual productive capacity and what they're marshalling and orchestrating is far, far greater than that. And, you know, most of the wealth of any farm is under the ground. We keep coming back to the same thing all the time. Without that microbial activity, without that engine of decomposition, you know, things eating other things and things in symbiotic relationships with other things. Without that, you've got very little, because you haven't got the air, you haven't got the light, you haven't got the sugars, and you haven't got the sort of the products of photosynthesis. Or you've got the product of photosynthesis, but not the consequence, the positive consequence that generates with the exchange of sugar and minerals and everything else. So the farmers, I don't know, so what does that say? It says that there is still a tremendous amount of resistance within rural communities. Most farmers will say that they can't afford to farm that way, even if they would like to. They think the risks are too high. You know, some farmers refuse to eat the food that they produce. I mean, that's pretty awful, isn't it?
Wow. Yes, that's so interesting, isn't it? And again, to draw the analogy with health and land management, often people don't make big changes until there's a significant trauma that they've experienced, and droughts are often that trauma, or bankruptcy, or facing that kind of thing. But
details that quite, you know, he says that there's this sort of crisis point which brings farmers to a change of pattern. Yeah.
But ultimately there's a philosophical point at which the farmer either accepts that their main job is a commodity, or their main job is to nurture the soil on which that commodity is grown to protect that crop and the future crops. It's the soil that's the big one. And I know, you know, you're one of the chapters in your book says never bare the earth, stories from the soil. Tell us a little bit about the role of animals in that process.
Well, never bearing the earth is to maintain your ground cover. That's the first step. I mean, obviously, when it gets really extreme, as it did at the end of the 3-year drought, a lot of farmers had completely destocked because they simply didn't have. It was a choice between feeding their animals or bearing the earth on their farm, and they weren't prepared to do that. Seeing that the investment in topsoil and holding that topsoil together and still provide, and you know, even though it's dead, that those grasses still provide really important habitat for a whole range of insects that benefit the ecology of that system, even in its sort of I was going to say, what's the word? Sort of crisp and dry state. There's still a lot going on, just less than there would be when you add lots of water to that system. So, yeah, a lot of people destocked completely. So getting access to things was more difficult. Although Southern Victoria and West Gippsland and around there, they did it pretty well, like they often do. For them it was dry, but that's not dry by any measure that anyone in New South Wales would have recognised. So we were still able to get stock from that farm.
Were you then casting your net much further? I mean, Australia's a pretty big country. How far would you go?
Well, we've only gone outside New South Wales for really particular reasons. Generally, it's searching for a particular. It has to be a distinct genetics or production system that would make it worthwhile to do that. Although having said that, we're probably just as close to sort of Victorian farms as we are to, in fact, closer than say the northwest of New South Wales. So having a New South Wales only policy isn't really the sort of thing for us. What we're looking for is ideally someone who's as close as possible, but if the production system is good or the reservoir of genetics is important to maintain, we will source from it. 90% of what we buy comes from New South Wales. We get a little from Victoria. We've just started getting some rare breed beef from Tasmania, and we get a tiny bit from Queensland.
And what sort of, like if we're talking, you mentioned Southdown lambs, what sort of diversity, how many different species of lambs are there that you draw on?
Probably throughout the year, maybe 12, 15.
Right, okay.
Or blends of those. And
in a commercial butcher shop, what would that be?
Well, mostly it's sort of one, essentially. They're probably working with a first cross ewe, which is a merino cross ewe with a Dorset ram over the top. So what they're selling is second cross on the whole, and that's really because the wool industry has determined the genetic, to a very large extent, has determined the genetic makeup of the national flock. So I'm sort of generally looking for animals that aren't really wool. Either they're not wool sheep, they're hair sheep, or shedding sheep, or where the value of the wool is not one of the first considerations. So they're the breeds that I'm looking for, but generally because the focus is on the meat quality in that case.
And what about the other standards like beef and pork and chickens?
Well, pork, all the pork that we buy is, and this is sort of crucial, there are two sort of things that really make us different, I think. One is that we only buy from farms that we visit, so 3 things. The other is that they have to be grown outside, that they're not grown in sheds at all, and 3, that there's a preference given to diverse genetics. So, in fact, when we started, our sort of tagline was rare breed providore, which we sort of moved past that because we saw it as just an aspect of what we were doing, not the whole reason of what we were doing. So genetic diversity is still incredibly important, but it isn't the only reason we're here. So those 3 things, and that we'd buy the meat on the bone, which changes the relationship to the producer completely. So instead of it going through a third party or a wholesaler who might draw on meat from a whole range of different farms. Now, some of that could be very good meat and very well produced. The thing is, you would never be able to know for sure, and you would never be able to repeat the experience. So what we were interested in was a very transparent model that could be repeated, and also not really saying this is super high quality meat. I mean, I think that sort of argument is circular and not very helpful, because what we're really trying to sort of say is account for it in a way which is, in a sense, quite sort of dry and objective. It was this aged animal, these were its genetics, it was grown on this farm by this person, and it was killed at this abattoir, and now it's been aged in our cool room for, say, 4 weeks. And if you think that's delicious meat, then I'm very pleased to hear that, but it's not why we bought it. We bought it because it represents an investment in that ecology. And of course, as Fred Provenza would make, it makes very clear, it's no coincidence that meat is delicious, because it's so phytochemically active, because it's eaten all of these grasses and perennials, which are probably sitting at between 8 and 10 or 8 and 12 bricks, which are themselves expressing themselves to the fullest potential, the genetic potential that they have, which then allows the animal to express itself to its full genetic potential, which, of course, allows us to express ourselves to our fullest genetic potential. So, these things are connected. They're not, but everything is produced. The battle that we have is that, people say, well, that's too expensive, because it's assumed that an apple equals an apple, or that this egg is the same as that egg. It's come out of a completely different production system, but there's nothing to differentiate it. And I think the science being done at the moment, which actually will be able to quite rapidly and cheaply demonstrate nutrient density of different foods, is going to change everything. Because then people will be able to not just buy a story and say, oh, well, I like all that detail you've told me, and I'll take that piece of meat home, or that cauliflower home. But it was particularly delicious, and it also contained all these things. So deliciousness directly relates to nutrient density. They're not separate activities,
And not just nutrient, not just that, but satiety.
Satiety.
Satiety. Yes. That's right.
It's a hard word.
It's a hard word, but
uses it all the time.
But if it was nutrient dense, we wouldn't be as hungry as perhaps we are, and that's an interesting part of the equation that's often overlooked as well.
Well, definitely, and it also explains why animals that only receive rations, standardised rations, are in a state of either excess or not having enough, because that idea of an average animal having an average diet is simply not true. There is no average. There is a continuum of need, and that changes day to day. It also changes if you depending on your gender, whether you're sort of in childbearing age, all of these things will have an immense impact on the requirements of the system. And anyone who's got teenage children will understand their requirements. It just, to someone who's a mature adult, is just astonishing. Like you think they couldn't possibly eat that. They do that 6 times a day somehow, but they do need it, and they need that because of the rapid growth, and they're going through.
It's quite an exciting idea to think that one day we may, well, not that far away, be able to just point our phone at a food and it will give us a complete nutrient profile of that food.
Yeah, well, I think
I don't think we're far off that, are we?
No, we're not that far off, and I think because that is a piece of the puzzle that we really need. So it's one thing to tell heartwarming stories. It's another to be able to sort of identify with committed farmers. But the other aspect is government-led incentives, and also the science of being able to understand that this food is different for a reason. It's not just coincidental that it comes out of a production system, and it is better. It is better for a range of reasons, but
when we see like there are all sorts of labels that are put onto foods like organic, biodynamic, free range. In terms of priority for you, when knowing what what's your priority list? What is the priority list there?
Well, a lot of what we stock is certified organic. It's not exclusively so, and I know that people use organic as a shorthand for better produced food, and I always get in trouble when I say this, but unfortunately it's not a good rule of thumb in some ways, because the absence of things doesn't guarantee anything. Actually, it guarantees a system that hasn't had certain inputs, is all it really tells you. What we're interested in is a system where the inputs or the productive system is actually operating close to its peak, so that soil is operating at its fullest genetic potential as well, and that you achieve that through farming methods. You actually asked it and I didn't answer it before, how the animals are utilised in a system like that. So it's crucial that animals are moved across a landscape. How quickly they return to that same area of the farm is dictated by largely seasonal conditions. So if it's a particularly good season, you might find that those cattle will be back on that same pasture within, say, 5 weeks. In the peak of the drought, it might have been 15 months. But the farmer who understands that, I think of them as orchestrators, really. I think of them as marshalling creative forces on their farm, and they're utilising the creative force to achieve the greatest outcome, which is not just meat production in our case and poultry, but it's a multifaceted sort of holistic understanding of what that creative capacity is. But they're artists. I think of them as artists. I think it's highly creative, observant, responsive people, and the best farmers are that. And I find them awesome, really, because their understanding and their sort of intuitive, recognition of things. And to do that, you have to put yourself in a different position to where most farmers put themselves. And I think that's sort of an artistic sort of position. It's also, we think of Indigenous knowledge, what that is, and I don't mean to in any way diminish it by saying this, but is the accumulation of 40,000 or 60,000 years of intense observational knowledge, which becomes art. When you know something that well and can it's part of you as much as it's part of it, and that's a really beautiful thing to watch, and it's also to observe it over time, because there are farms that we've visited, now for 12, 14 years. We've had producers we've worked with almost since the start, and seeing the changes on their farm through good seasons and bad seasons is inspiring.
Now, you mentioned also you want to buy meat off on the bone, and you introduced in the book, you talk about meat in and out of a box. And I don't think a lot of people fully appreciate when they walk through their butcher, the supermarket and all that, what the difference is between meat in and out of the box is. Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, well, so it's a change that's really happened in the last 20 or 30 years with the sort of concentration of power, largely through the supermarkets and their production. The abattoir is now the butcher shop in that model. What happens at the actual retail outlet will be just simply a portioning of that, and maybe the application of a sauce or some sort of value-adding process that goes on. But the slaughter, boning, packaging all happens at the abattoir, which means that the animal is boned. Often they don't even bone it when it's cold now. It's boned hot and goes straight into plastic and then straight into a box. So that preserves the full weight of it, which means that from a commodity point of view, when you've only got one value, which is weight, then there's no incentive to do anything else, really, is there? And that's the other thing that really sort of irks me about the commodity market, is that there is simply no room for any other quality apart from weight, which is a very sort of thin understanding of what that product is. We've already talked about sort of nutrient capacity, its footprint on the land that it was grown on, its ecological footprint, and the benefits that it might accrue, as opposed to the negative things. None of that's embedded in that. And what we're trying to sort of say is that we sell meat with qualities, not quality meat, and they're embedded in there through the decisions, the genetics, and then the decisions of the farmer who's marshalled those genetics in the service of a really particular production system.
Yeah, I actually did read through that, and now that you mention it like that, I'd never quite hit me that wrapping it in plastic as quickly as possible is a great way of preserving the weight, and it's the weight that you pay for.
But you don't really want all that moisture. So
no,
age
that's right.
The meat, like from a quality point of view, you don't want
yes.
So when we age the meat, it's drying gently, and it's allowing also an aerobic change in the meat, which is quite profound. There are naturally occurring enzymes in the meat are activated, and they actually break down the muscle structure, and they fray the fibers that make up the muscles, and that fraying produces more tender meat in the form of dry aged meat. But it also, as a result of that enzymatic action, it produces a flavour profile which is all in the earthy spectrum, and anyone who's aged or likes to drink, say, aged red wine will recognise those flavours. You have your primary fruit characters, and then underneath that, in aged red wine or wrapped around that, you'll have these earthy flavours. So the interesting thing for me is that I didn't recognise that when I started, that when I now see my cool room full of bodies of beef, I think of them not dissimilarly to bunches of grapes or bottles of wine. They're the product of a very similar process, the same process. There's just been a mediation in that instead of drawing directly from the earth itself, they're fed on the product of the earth. But the processes that give it form are determined by its particular genetics, clearly. Then its flavour development and how it ages, they're so similar. Of course, everything is connected, and so of course, they're all made of the same stuff. So it probably, it's almost sort of too obvious to say that they should actually be similar. But most people would look at a bunch of grapes and a steak and say, well, they have nothing in common at all.
Well, or even a loaf of bread. I mean, the white sliced bread compared to a really flavoursome sourdough, the process that's gone on there, it's kind of enabling nature to take its course rather than dominating. And I thought that's another concept that I love. The other one is using the whole animal. We've become very focused on just a few cuts.
Yeah.
But
well, that's what's sold to us. The commodity market really is only interested in selling you one or two cuts. Our palates have been severely infantilized, so tenderness is rated above everything. And and you are the perfect person to talk to this about. We have teeth for a reason, and we do not need to eat really soft things all the time unless you're in some ways, really challenged. In fact, we give our dogs bones to keep their gums healthy and to stimulate their teeth. And, a life of mince for a dog is torture, really.
Well, you'd be interested, Grant, to know that Sydney University recently did a study on chewing and mental acuity. So there's a strong connection there. Look, I just thought this book of The Ethical Omnivore, which the title in itself is so appealing and challenging for us all. And I think there's just not only so many great points raised in it, but some great recipes in it too. I wonder if as we finish up now, I might just take a step back from your role as a butcher and your connection with the land, because as individuals, we're all on this health journey through life in this modern world. What do you think some of the biggest challenges, or what do you think the biggest challenge is for people on that journey?
I think probably, again, Fred Provenza is useful in this. Learning to listen to our own bodies is an enormous challenge for all of us. And in the industrial food landscape, you're certainly not encouraged to do that. And each of us has particular tastes that are associated with our needs. What we find palatable is directly related to what we need, if we listen well enough to it. Food technologists get in the way of that because they're able to, a bit like people who design poker machines, they're able to work with the trigger centers and pleasure centers and reward centers in our brain and trick them, essentially. So a little bit of salt, a certain amount of crispness, all of these things which our bodies are designed to react to for natural, very good sort of survival reasons. Largely we're duped. So being able to find food that is as least adulterated as possible, I suppose, is the challenge, and then being able to do something worthwhile with it. But I mean, the trouble, it's not trouble. It isn't hard to do good things with whole food. It does take more time, and education is crucial, and exposure to places where food is produced is crucial. I think it hasn't just been the rural communities that have been emptied out. People who live in the cities, connection with those rural communities has been severed. When I was growing up, it was, every second person had a relative that lived on a farm, and they visited there at holidays, and, they watched the sheep being shorn or whatever it might be. There was a much more direct connection to rural life and food production life. We pretend that it sort of doesn't exist, or that we don't need it, or you can go to a 24-hour gym, but you don't need to see where your food's grown. I mean, it's sort of I don't know. I mean, it's easy to think that it's insoluble, but it's not. It requires and each little step makes a difference. I mean, the message of hope. There are sort of two messages of hope in amongst what might be seen as a fairly bleak scenario. And they are that soils are remarkably resilient and will recover from decades of misuse and abuse within a generation. And that, in most cases, not always, if they're completely chemically poisoned, then that might be very hard to do. But different production systems will allow those self-organising systems of fertility to actually function again, providing you've obviously got water and light. But I read Rachel Carson the other day, and it's the first time that I'd actually read Silent Spring. It's sort of one of those ubiquitous books. You feel like you've probably read it because it's cited your entire life. I was really struck by it. I'd sort of understood it to be just a tale of birds dying in spring because of chemical use. She's a biologist who methodically pulls apart the chemical poisoning of animals. That book was written 59 years ago.
Yes.
It's as old. It's the same age as me, and yes, it was actually salutary and also highly depressing. We've known this stuff for 59 years. This was documented without doubt. In fact, the chemicals we're using now are probably more powerful than the chemicals that they were using there. The DDT, the 2,4,5-T, the Agent Orange, these things were only banned in Australia in 1984. It took proving that they thinned the shells of raptors to the point where they had addled eggs and unviable eggs. But we sort of knew this anyway, but apparently you've got to spend 55 years researching that to demonstrate that, wow, widespread poisoning of the environment produces consequences for the top of the food chain. I mean, who would have thought,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean...
So two things for hope, soils being one of them.
Yes, and the other is that your own health and can recover as well, and that through a changed lifestyle and I won't use that word. A change.
That's okay. You can.
And exercise, just like an engagement with productive forces of life, is able to produce profound changes. It's about connection. In the end, it is about connection. One of the things that I'm most proud of Feather and Bone being able to do is it provides lateral connection as well as longitudinal. By that I mean, while we connect farmers with the people that buy the meat or poultry or whatever they produce, we also connect the buyers together and the producers together. And that model it's the same model as lateral gene transfer, which happens under the ground all the time. It's a decentered informational spread, and that is also a message of hope. You do not need hierarchical systems of information dissemination to produce real change. It happens through community. It happens through people talking to each other. It happens, and food is the ideal vehicle for that connection. Everybody must come to the table, hopefully 2 times a day at least. And in coming to the table, you're able to share more than just the food. You're able to share the qualities of that productive system that gave birth to it.
Yeah. Well, Grant, thank you as a retail customer. Thank you for making those connections, and thank you for making this connection today and sharing your knowledge and journey with us.
My pleasure, Ron. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Wow. Well, we covered some territory there. For those that aren't familiar with it, BRICS, B-R-I-X, is a measure of food, of the sugar in food. And Grant was mentioning on a few occasions there the microbiome within the soil, and of course the microbes within the soil, which includes not just bacteria but mycorrhizal fungi, break down the nutrients in the soil and make them available to the plant. And the more nutrient dense the food is, the higher the BRICS value. And he drew that analogy with the ability to smell the food. And there are some foods that you have a really strong smell to, and he used basil as an example of that. But I thought that was really interesting, and a really interesting idea of measuring nutrient density within a food, and how exciting to eventually be able to use our mobile phone or a device to literally point it at the food you're about to buy and determine whether that is a nutrient-dense food or not. But boy, what a game changer that is going to be, because as we have often said on this podcast, seemingly cheap food is only cheap when you don't factor in the health and in the environmental costs by which it is grown. Another important concept there was biodiversity, and again reinforcing that idea that the more biodiverse a landscape is, the more resilient it is and the healthier it is. And I loved Grant drawing the fact that we should be listening more to our bodies, because any regular listener to our podcast will know that's an important thing for us to be doing. We get report cards from our bodies each and every day, and we should be listening to it. Our skin is a report card, because 80% of skin problems are a reflection of gut dysbiosis. And of course, that episode, that golden episode, What Does Our Poo Say About You? That's a report card we get each and every day, and we should be listening to our body. And I love those two rays of hope. That soil, if it's well managed, and again, this is where animals come into it. It's not the resource which is the problem. Animal agriculture is not the problem. It's the way that agriculture is managed that is the problem. And if it is managed well, then animals are healthier. The land on which they graze is healthier. The food that they produce is healthier. We are healthier, and the planet is healthier. It takes 500 years for nature to grow an inch or 2.5 centimeters of soil. On a well-managed regenerative agriculture farm, 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters of soil can be regenerated every 3 to 5 years versus 500 years. And we need that soil to grow the food. So I thought when he said the two rays of hope are that our soils can be rebuilt when they are well managed, is an important one. And the fact that we are able to rebuild ourselves, the human body is incredibly resilient, thank goodness for that. And we can turn our health around by making informed decisions. What I love about the book and what I love about Feather and Bone, where Grant is literally making those connections for us, and that is the connection between us, our dinner plate, what we put on our dinner table, and the farmers that grow it, is a really important service. And I honestly believe that farmers should be the most revered people in our society. They grow the healthy food that we need to be healthy, and they nurture the healthy soils that we need to grow that healthy food in, not just for us now, but for future generations. And I think the more that we can connect and honor and revere those people that are doing that on the farm, well, I take my hat off to them, and I think they are just fantastic. Look, the last century was the century of the revered financier or stockbroker, and look where that got us. Yes, I know the Dow Jones has never been higher, but big deal about that. Our environment, our health could be a whole lot better, and that's why this century has to be the century of the revered farmer. Look, I hope you enjoyed that episode. I hope this finds you well. Until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions.